Well, my name is Eric Smith, and I'm with my wonderful partners, Mackenzie Tucker and Gunnar Sneed. What we'll be going over today is the assessment of ROTC cadet performance capabilities using VR metrics associated with survey responses. Disclosure-wise, we have no financial or commercial interests. So in the battlefield, their operational effectiveness is going to be directly correlated with our ability to mental and physical abilities. When you're in that battlefield scenario, it's a split-second decision that you have to make. Am I going to kill the person across from me that's trying to kill me, or are they going to go after me? So what is going to cause a prolonged amount of time before you can make that decision? Well, when we think about that, we think of brain stuff. What's causing all of our higher order decisions to be made? Well, you take a bunch of hits to the brain, you're going to have a longer time to take to be able to be efficient. So what is happening is those white matter and gray matter tracks in our brain are not connecting to each other. And we are going to have an issue with the decision-making process. They're not going to be able to, I got to slow my breathing. I got to be able to make those decisions. I got to be able to fight in those situations. So as I said before, our emotional and behavioral cognitive well-being is going to be affecting what we're going to be able to do in those situations. So what better way to assess those than using virtual reality metrics? They're going to be able to tell us our way that we can control those metrics of breathing and concentrating on what's going on. So we talk about sleep is a very important concept when it comes to being effective in the battlefield, and those mood disorders such as your depression, anxiety, and stress. So as we look at somebody that may have depression, they're going to be slower. You give somebody antidepressants, they're going to be able to be faster in these situations. So think of it this way. You gunk up your brain throughout the day. There's so much connectivity that has to happen. There's so much going on. There's a lot of traffic going along in the brain. Think of it as New York City. You've got all this gunk, you've got all this trash building up in the brain. But if you slow that down when you sleep, it allows the cerebral spinal fluid to wash out those tau proteins, to name one of the proteins of many other things that are happening. Allows it to wash out. You sleep, it goes down to, like, say, the size of Chattanooga, even smaller, and that is able to wash out those tau proteins within the brain. So yes, sleep, very important. So the history of MTBI, it's just very important to have these sleep capabilities. You have poor sleep, you're going to be slower. You have better sleep, you're going to be faster. And this all relates to how they said on their surveys, how that relates to that overall wellness, to the concussion ability, or how many concussions they had. Let's think of it this way too. You got sleep and you got your concussions. Are you having these injuries that are going to cause, and these are related, are you going to have the concussions that affect the sleep, which are going to add to the prolonged amount of time that it's going to take to respond, or are you already having these underlying issues with sleep that could have come from brain inflammation, some sort of issue with sleep, and then that causes you to be more predisposed to concussions, which then ultimately give you the prolonged time that it takes to respond. And what better way to do this than getting something that takes very accurate movements within our VR testing that shows, hey, how good am I going to be on the battlefield? How fast am I going to be able to turn my neck? How fast am I going to be able to pull the trigger? How am I going to be able to slow down my processing to be able to be efficient? So as I've been saying and kind of rambling on, but our purpose is to determine whether the immersive VR perceptual motor metrics from the ROTC cadets, their subjective ratings, how are they going to be able to do relating to sleep with concussions and with their overall wellness scores.
Okay, so for our study, we looked at 40 ROTC cadets on UTC. We had 30 males ranging in age from 18 to 30, and we had 10 females ranging in age from 10 to 18. Our only exclusion criteria were people that were previously injured that could not physically complete the VR testing. So the first thing we administered was an overall wellness index. It consists of 10 categories of different problems that people experience. And then each category has like a subset of problems that they mark. So previous studies have shown that physical problems, sleep and stamina, and mood emotions were all the most indicative of a high or a lower OWI score. So we looked at those in our study. And they mark which problems they're experiencing and then how often they experience it, and that's how it's scored. And then we also administered VR testing. It's 40 trials of full body movement involving eyes, neck, arm, and step. And then they received auditory feedback and static feedback when they made their selection. The initial screen is for them there in the middle with the 2 dots. Once they hit their T-codes, the distance is coordinated based on their arm length. And then their movements are decided based on what they see on the screen. If it's a solid circle, they move in the same direction. If it's an open circle, they move in the opposite direction. And it comes from center and from peripheral.
So our big concept here, looking at operational definitions of VR metrics. So you start out with your stimulus onset and going on to the movement and the completer response. All of that falls into the response time. Starting out with the stimulus onset and the movement. So you're seeing it, you're making a decision. There's even a part of it where we get that 6 degrees or 10 centimeters where you start doing your movement before you've decided which way to go, before you've planned out your pathway. So that's why that's kind of included on the movement onset. And then the max values are just for the entire response, because past those 6 degrees or 10 centimeters, you get the rest of your response. And then we use ROTC curves and cross tabulations to compare the VR metrics and our OWI scores associated with them. So like Mackenzie said, we had 40 trials. So we looked at the means as well as the trial to trial. So we had our intra-individual variability. So how much did it change trial to trial, which is what got us our 18 different measurements. So you look at perceptual latency, like we said, the visual and cognitive part, and then also the movement part, and then response time overall. So that was 16 of our measurements. After that, we have RCS, so our rate correct score. So how many are you getting right compared to looking at your perceptual latency versus your response time? The first thing we looked at, so our OWI less than 90 was our cutoff. That was our median, and we called that suboptimal wellness. So the 3 things we looked at in there, so we had history of concussion, which very high specificity and odds ratio on that. So people that were scoring under 90, it's very likely that they were also having concussion, at least in our group. And then our 2 big predictors were the neck perceptual latency, so how much of that neck movement between trials, and also your rate correct score of the perceptual latency. So the cut points, it's kind of confusing all the numbers, but looking at rate correct score, if you're getting less than that 1.147 correct responses in a second, you're getting less than that, there's an elevated risk that, or likelihood that you were in that suboptimal wellness group. And then also with the perceptual latency of the neck, was it taking you longer than 0.241 seconds to generate like your first little bit of movement? Going through the scoring, like Mackenzie said, they're scored based on frequency and how recent. You're handed your score, that's multiplied by 2, and then that score that you receive for that section is taken off of 100. So you start out at 100 and it works your way down based on how frequent or relevant that is to you. And then our 3 biggest predictors were the mood, emotional, sleep, stamina, and then physical problems. And you can see on the graph, those were the 3 on the top. So those are the ones we try to key in on. And then looking at those key 3 and relating it back to VR metrics, rate correct score and neck perceptual latency again are up there, same cut points as before, and relatively good predictors of if you were selecting problems in these categories that you were still going to fall or perform well or not well in the neck and perceptual latency. And then we also looked at arm target, so total response time, so average and between trial. So if you're having more than 1.4 seconds of response time for a trial, which we've gone through these trials, it's not very intensive. So it's taking you more than 1.5 seconds. You could, reasonably surmise that more reaction time or more response time, probably going to be a higher risk for something not communicating in the brain. And then also between trials. So was there more than 0.64 seconds between your trials? Was there inconsistencies in how often you were able to get your hand to that target?
If we were finding that if they were answering anything that dealt with sleep and some of the other stuff, it was going to be a driving factor. Even if they put, we showed on the 1, 5 to 0, if they put anything above a 1 for sleep and some of the other categories, it was going to be a strong driver that for the rest of the OWI, they were going to answer poorly.
And then zooming in just a little bit more from those key three was sleep, which we found to be our greatest predictor. If anything on that, so any of the scores greater or a 1 or greater, so if you had any problems with more frequently than a year, we were looking at these VR metrics again, neck, perceptual latency, and break score up there, similar cut points. And once again, we found especially neck perceptual latency, very good predictor of if you were having above that cut point. So if you weren't performing well in that first 6 degrees, if it took you too long or it was inconsistent, it's very likely that you also answered that you had some sleep or stamina problems. And then also the arm target, so response time, again, another predictor. So was it taking you too long? Was it inconsistent? And most of the time we were finding, especially with those odds ratios, that if they were inconsistent and taking a while, not scoring, or I guess scoring high in sleep, but that's a bad thing.
Okay, so looking specifically at the perceptual latency, which is time from the stimulus onset to the movement. Looking at the differences in neck movement time in individuals and the rate correct score, it was associated with a poor overall wellness index. The 3 key problems that we identified, if you score a 3 out of 15 in those 3 categories total, you're more likely to have poor wellness. And then sleep and stamina, scoring anything a 1 or above in the sleep stamina category also was predictive. And then finally, a history of concussion was associated with suboptimal wellness scores, which we classified as below 90. So the intra-individual variability in the responses is believed to show poor neural efficiency. Specifically, the neck rotation is linked to vestibular dysfunction following concussions. And then disordered sleep seems to be the biggest indicator of axonal injury and poor clearance of the metabolites through the lymphatic system that Eric talked about earlier.
Anything else there?
Yeah, that was that whole thing on New York City and Chattanooga. That's the lymphatic system walking away the proteins in the brain.
Okay, so we found that there is a common mechanism that is linking all of these problems they're experiencing: the disordered sleep, the overall pain, the mood and emotional problems. And then that's seen in people with or without history of concussion. So RVR picked up people that were reporting previous concussions and also not reporting concussion. So we believe that the immersive VR is providing meaningful measurements for this measurement of this function. And when combining that with OWI, we can predict individuals that will have impaired brain processing, especially those ROTC cadets that are out and about and trying to make split-second decisions that otherwise would not be detected with the testing that we have now.
All right, this is open up for questions.